Today's episode will see Alexander Corn and I interrogating the topic of Defence of Australia. We will be joined by a subject matter expert who is a retired lifelong Air Force officer, and I'm sure that he will be able to shed greater light on what is going on than we as lay people understand. But we certainly hope that he might be able to point out exactly what's happening in our Defence Force, because our politicians talk an awful lot about things, but we don't see as the normal citizen what's really going on.
In fact, our Defence Force could be likened to a duck swimming serenely along, whereas below the waterline, there's a lot of work going on.
One would hope so, given the current challenging international geopolitical environment. One would hope, and with the recent re-election of a president in the United States who has a habit of saying whatever comes to the top of his mind.
He's quite good at projecting American force.
It's certainly through his own physical will, yes. We would hope that we might hear more from Warwick Paddon, who is our guest. So welcome to our subject matter expert on this occasion, Mr. Warwick Paddon, who is a retired Air Force officer who's had decades of experience in the field in both military and military diplomatic posts. And I think that's an accurate description, is it not, Warwick?
45 years in the Air Force, mostly in the field or in management. Only one real position as a diplomat, but that was 3 years in Berlin and Beirut.
In Beirut. That would have been fascinating. Subject for a whole other discussion.
A bit more fascinating if I were there now.
Well, yes.
Not only fascinating, but potentially sleepless in Beirut.
A little bit dangerous, yeah. So let's return to the topic. Does Australia actually have the ability to defend itself in the event of a fairly conventional attack?
I think that's easily answered as yes, and yes with confidence. It comes down to definitions, of course, who's attacking, what with, and perhaps more importantly, for what purpose. The ideas of country A attacking country B and then occupying it, taking resources, can come down to an economic question. Arguably, the Japanese achieved in the 70s economically what they didn't achieve in the 40s. So that would determine what sort of attack, who is attacking, and what they would regard as success. And what we might regard as a successful defence would be denying them their success. So what does that look like? It all depends on the day, on who's doing what. If you ask what sort of things could we not defend against without outside help, then that would be a major adversary, nuclear armed, able to project and sustain long-term projection of an occupying force. But even then, we would be able to adopt some sort of guerrilla warfare. You look how successfully Hezbollah is defending southern Lebanon. I imagine Taiwan has a similar sort of concept. Singapore used to describe their defence policy as the poison prawn. Many countries could invade and occupy them, but their defence force will make them very sick.
So one of the benefits that we have, and you mentioned the ability of a traditional attack to be sustained. So we used to have the philosophy during WW2 of the Brisbane line, that we would fall back to roughly across the country where Brisbane is and let them starve to death up there, or freeze at night and fry during the day. That, in a conventional sense, obviously must still have some benefit because of our sheer size and the lack of population. But as to your point, it depends upon what they're after. If an invading force is after only mineral resources in the top northwest corner of the country, they don't need to do anything in the rest of the country necessarily. It's then our job to come back and counterattack if somebody were to take possession of, say, assets up there.
Well, the classic quote is war is pursuit of politics by other means. So really what an adversary would be after would be a political outcome. It may be surrender, it may be relinquishing an alliance, or it may be not doing something for someone else. So there are many ways to define and declare success. It may be they want to make life so difficult for us that we might not come to the aid of America in a conflict in the South China Sea, for example, putting up the cost to us of that insurance policy that we think we have. So I think I've got off the track a little bit, but your logistics side of it is crucial, and your Brisbane line analogy, I think, is can be expanded to talk about really logistics sustainability. And I sometimes, in the 80s, we used to talk about the sea air moat, this enormous gap to the north of Australia. And anyone threatening Australia in a traditional, conventional sense would have to come from or through that area to the north. And that's an enormous logistical problem. Imagine people used to fear, let's say, the Russians are coming to invade. So imagine they came and occupied Broome. It's got a port, I assume. It's got an airfield, small population support. Okay, fine. Well, let's put a fence around that. Well, there's probably only a road in and out from the south and north. There's probably not a lot. It's not a difficult place to isolate. An awful lot of water that the adversary's got to get through there. One of the things they'll need is water. I don't know what the water supply is at Broome, but if it were another place that was isolated that didn't have water, we'd just simply wait and give them 3 or 4 days and say, would you like a glass of water? Logistically, because I look at it from the other side, if we were to try and do that to another place, the amount of, I remember 97, I think, was the Timor-Leste concern when Australia helped the government there assert their independence in the face of a few challenges. And I spent a few weeks in charge of what was called the Combined Airlift Wing. So this was based in Darwin and transport aircraft from, I think, 7 countries, maintaining an air bridge, a bit like the Berlin Airlift, into Timor-Leste, 20-odd flights a day. And that was just a massive volume of stuff going in. And even that, we didn't have the capacity to put bottled water on. The Navy chartered some ships, I think it was a catamaran, to do the heavy lift to get stuff in there. So that sort of effort, just to sustain what was really quite a small footprint of a headquarters with General Cosgrove and his staff, 20-odd large cargo aircraft, plus I think 2 ship deliveries from Darwin a year. And that's really just the basics. This wasn't flying in ammunition for artillery and that sort of stuff.
So in the context of, say, things that people are familiar with from now no longer from living memory, but certainly from video, films and actual carbon footage, the invasion of D-Day, where massive troops arrived on the beaches to establish a beachhead, but the battlefront was right there. It wasn't 2,000 kilometres away, and it couldn't be totally isolated in the same way that you're describing parts of Australia could be.
Yes, so I'm not quite sure I follow the question.
Well, what I'm suggesting is that
would we have another D-Day?
The question is that to reassert the question, it's that our geography actually works in our favour in terms of conventional war fighting.
Yes.
Being an island continent so far away from potential adversaries is to our benefit. But as a counterpoint to that, our potential allies, or our one known major ally, the Americans, are also a fair distance away. Or are they? Do they have enough resource here that they can assist us in that sort of isolating of any conventional attack, or would they have to come to our aid? And would they, is the next question. So that's a two-part question.
I think your analogy of D-Day is probably quite a good one, because if we go back to that, you'd look at the size of forces that were required to make that lodgement into Europe. A lot of forces from a lot of different countries, a lot of planning, and a lot of sea lift to get and airlift. And
they
that
went through
was
5 different landing points as well.
and that was within swimming distance
Yes.
of they only had to travel
22 miles.
22 miles.
The southern ones were.
So that's a bit further, okay.
Yes, but by comparison to coming through from, let's say, if a force occupied Java and tried to come down through there, it's a lot longer, a lot more sea air gap that we can exercise our control. So this is why we have a defence force that can exercise control of the sea, so the ships, the submarines, and control of the air. So that's the aeroplanes can deny the enemy ships or deny enemy aircraft coming through there. And, of course, that's why we have this over-the-horizon radar, which can look into those areas and monitor what's coming and direct our scarce resources to where they're needed. Because any threat to Australia, any physical traditional threat, basically has to come from somewhere, and it has to come in some sort of quantity that can sustain itself for a while.
And that makes it, because of our geographic isolation, makes it very obvious that somebody's on their way. But also I think it's important that to consider the difficulty of projecting and resupplying a force over such a massive distance before you even arrive on our continent allows plenty of time for political or diplomatic efforts to try to de-escalate, but also provides a lot of time to plan for defence.
Indeed, and I think John's point was about, part of the question was about, does America have resources here to support? And I'm not sure that's I'm not sure that the resources in Australia are subdivided in that regard. We have shared capabilities, shared stockpiles, or stockpiles that we would share. Mm-hmm. And one of the benefits we get from such a close interoperability with Americans is that we use the same fuel in the vehicles, we use the same rounds in the cannons, etc. So what's mine is yours and yours is mine. And I think we saw in the Second World War that the American logistics industrial base is able to produce mass amounts of what's required and transship it. And the airlift capacity has just only increased dramatically since that time.
So if conventional attack on Australia for whatever political outcome is desired is more than likely quite costly, both in material and in men, would it be then more likely that an aggressor would seek more unconventional and modern means such as cyber warfare?
I think so. Sometimes people talk about hybrid warfare. Remember the Russian soldiers with green uniforms but no markings on them, little green men they call them, going into Ukraine initially, cutting undersea cables, as we've seen this last few days in the Baltic Sea and other places previously, cyber warfare, attacks on health system, banking system. We saw how fragile the American electricity grid was on the East Coast a couple of decades ago. They had a problem in a power station. I don't think it was a cyber attack, but the problem in one power station cascaded. We had a similar version on a smaller scale with a South Australian storm problem. So there was no shortage of damage that could be done to, or disruption that could be done through cyber means. Fortunately, in the last decade or so, Australia's probably longer stepping up capabilities to learn, monitor, and to be able to fight those sorts of warfare. Don't forget climate change. One of the effects can be mass migration. People in Northern Europe are talking about weaponisation of migration into Finland and Norway. So there are a number of different things that could be done to apply pressure on the Australian government to produce a different political position from what might be our choice otherwise.
Are we have we given away control of too much of our critical infrastructure to foreign entities who could be coerced to work in interests other than ours?
I'm not sure. Government has clear policy and processes for vetting those things. We talk about a port in Darwin being owned by a Chinese company. I'm not sure the scale of the threat that arises out of that. We have some capacity to monitor those things. We have capacity to renationalise things if the need arises. The question arises, but I guess the question in my mind is, what are the threats? What are the hazards that we're trying to mitigate by foreign ownership?
Do you think we'd be able to actively defend ourselves if an aggressor did manage to land a significant number of troops into Sydney Harbour, Melbourne Harbour, Port of Melbourne, Port of Brisbane? Would we be able to physically hold them off?
It would depend on the warning time and what they were trying to achieve. A massive number of troops would, again, just simply for sustainability purposes, they would need to be concentrated in an area. If they caught us by surprise, they may well achieve a landing, and it may well take some time before we could block their progress. But how far they would get, I doubt that they'd be capable of taking over all of Sydney. If you look at, again, Second World War, Berlin, the Soviet forces that were put in there to recapture Berlin after the Allies had bombed the bejesus out of it. I think 80-odd thousand Russians died trying to recapture Berlin. So urban warfare is pretty awful, very uncertain, and we're seeing that in the Middle East, how unreliable it is. People think that they have cleaned out 80% of capability and decapitated the leadership, and yet Hamas is still firing about the same number of missiles into Israel that they've been firing for a long time.
You mentioned before denying a potential aggressor access to areas that are on an approach path to Australia. And you made mention of our ships and submarines. And, of course, a great deal of conversation has been around the AUKUS Pact since it was announced by the previous government now nearly 3 years ago. 3 years on, we haven't seen anything other than talk, really. Are we likely to ever see anything other than talk, or are we eventually just going to throw up our hands in horror and buy Virginia-class submarines secondhand from the Americans?
I think that's a bit harsh, John.
Well, I'm here to pose a question, perhaps being harsh is part of it.
I know Jonathan Mead, the naval officer in charge of the AUKUS program, and he's a very, very solid, capable, smart chap and energetic. There has been much done. One of the early stages is Australia investing in American industry, which takes a while, so that we can jointly have the capacity. Another thing that's been achieved is the foreign export, the licensing, the problems. Getting military equipment out of America is an administrative nightmare. One of the benefits we get from the alliance is we sometimes get a fast track foreign military sales, or there are different hurdles or barriers that are put in the way. And a lot of work has been done on that. And also part of AUKUS is what they call Pillar 2, is information sharing and other processes. And I think work is being done on that. Getting back to your point, though, about boats in the water, what's the future likely to be? I don't know. It's political on both sides of the Pacific, but it's something we could do if we wanted to do as a nation. I would imagine there is a lot of scope for cooperation in construction. Clearly, there is a deficit in supply in building, one of my personal thoughts is a solution, and it may be what they're planning anyway, is that we co-build the two different fleets. So as we do with aeroplanes that we buy from America down here in Melbourne, Australia manufactures certain components for all of the F-35 fleets wherever they go in the world. That's given rise to some demonstrations about Australia exporting arms, etc. So there's no reason we couldn't do that with shipbuilding or submarine building. If you look at break a submarine down into some different bits, basically it's a very expensive cigar tube with a propulsion system and a bunch of electronics inside. I'm sure it's well within Australia's ability to build the cigar tubes.
Yes.
We know the nature of the agreement is that the propulsion, the nuclear propulsion, is going to be a black box which gets popped into it like a battery into a torch, probably a bit more complicated than that. But we don't have to lay awake at night learning how to build nuclear propulsion systems. We just build the tube.
You just buy them off GE or whoever produces them. Yeah.
I think Rolls-Royce.
Rolls-Royce these?
We've invested some money in the factory.
Because of the UK involvement, yes.
And so then there's all the avionics, whatever they call them in submarines. The
Underwater avionics.
Underwater
the subonics.
Subonics, yes.
Which are basically systems that we're buying and using anyway. So I don't think it's beyond our abilities to do that. How many we need, how quickly we could do it. If we had a joint workforce, I think the German submarines, when I was dealing with them, proposed that they would take control of the shipyard in Australia and South Australia, but they would insist that the first two boats be built in the German dockyards in Kiel with the Australian workers learning on the job, and then they would come down. So a similar situation, which would also mean that we're augmenting the American workforce. Right. It means that our boats could be maintained in America, American boats could be maintained for us. Yes, thank you very much. The Treasurer would be very pleased if we start servicing American submarines.
So the political element you mentioned at the outset there, and of course there's a new political reality that's dawned upon the world after the 5th of November of this year with the Great Orange Man returning. He has already made comments during his election campaign that he would be increasing the American capacity to produce boats. One would hope that would work in our favour. One would hope that our politicians know how to handle him. So that's a whole other question for a whole other time. But you mentioned the interoperability. So our forces have operated closely together for a very long time, and you see that as being a significant benefit in being able to ramp up if the political will is there.
Absolutely, and it's a benefit to both sides because America benefits from the surveillance and reconnaissance done by our submarines. Indeed, they're probably the primary customer for some of that. Some of where that information comes from. So it's in their interest having us crewing boats doing work that some of their boats would have to do. If it makes sense for America and it makes sense for us, then it's going to be a fairly obvious sort of thing to do. The more difficult questions for us are how many boats do we need? How much money do we put into each boat? And perhaps more challenging will be raising, training and sustaining the crews.
So with that in mind, would there be a better way, a better avenue to spend the money to get the same or a better result down the track, or maybe sooner than the deployment of these boats, which probably would be still another 12 to 15 years away at least?
I think there's no shortage of opportunities. We're talking a large chunk of money spent over 10, 15, 20 odd years. I can't remember the life of the program. But the opportunity cost. So if we go back to my earlier comments about the best, I think that might have been before we started the interview, the best defence policy is a good economy. So if we're starting to look at opportunity costs of that investment, would we do better to invest it into ports, roads, industry, get TSMC to build a chip factory? I don't know. That would drive a completely different set of benefits. How we would compare them to, or those to military type outcomes is difficult. But I think it's a fair question to compare those. And then you look at the nation itself, the population, the education, the health of the nation, the people that will carry the guns and wear the boots if we have to go to war. We could put a large amount of money in there and change the way that we educate people, fitness. We could put a large bunch into some sort of national service like the Singaporean model. Or we could put it into different platforms, different types of platforms. We could put more aeroplanes or more tanks or cheap submarines first, or we can keep the existing submarines going, which costs a lot. It's like flying old aeroplanes. You can do it forever. It just costs more and more and more. And eventually the F-111s became unviable, the cost of maintaining them. The same with the Collins class, the current submarines. So the question is, again, what's the outcome we're going to get from those boats? What's the cost? And then what's the opportunity cost of putting that money into that? The other thing about the nuclear boats is they go very fast. So you think the Maserati or the McLaren of cars, their biggest asset is their stealth, their invisibility, the lack of awareness of their presence. Now, that can be discovered from time to time. If that happens, they can very quickly be somewhere else a long way away, very, very quickly. And the nuclear engine gives them that speed and the ability to sustain the speed.
What sort of speed are we talking about, roughly?
I don't know the Australian boats, but I asked myself that question and did a little search on the internet. And slightly humorous aside here, the Soviets hold the world underwater speed record, which I think was 40-something knots, 47 knots or 43 or 45.
Which is equivalent to about 65, 70 kilometres an hour?
Slightly problematic. It's like boasting about building the world's biggest microchip. They built two submarines out of titanium.
Yes.
They were so expensive, they were nicknamed the Golden Boat. And these things actually got that speed record, but they made so much noise, it was deafening the sailors. They said it was like jet engines going inside the boat. And I mentioned that the whole point of submarines is that you don't know where they are.
So stealth was kind of nullified.
Times 10.
So if I can just jump onto a slightly tangential topic, it said that we have 3 weeks' supply of diesel in Australia, and our strategic reserve is located just round the corner in America. But from what you've said previously, it doesn't sound like that's particularly an issue. Or do you think that our strategic energy reserve should be held onshore?
I don't know what the benchmark is today for the reserves, but I have no doubt that there are strategic reserves of various forms of energy, let's say diesel fuel, aviation fuel, because so much comes from overseas, from Singapore. We need to have minimum holdings. How much we have varies from year to year. And I remember at one point we used to use it to balance the budget because if Air Force was running a bit tight on budget, the big fuel reservoirs would come down towards the minimum holdings. But if we had a bit of a surplus, a bit of softness in the budget, as they used to say, then we'd top up the fuel tanks. So there's a bit of variation there that is just seasonal. But I've no doubt that we have significant amounts. How much is enough? It depends. Tell me what war we're going to fight. Tell me what systems we're going to put into war. But if you have nuclear submarines, we need less diesel.
This is true.
And it's environmentally friendly as well.
And we're going to have nuclear submarines without a nuclear industry. Leave it for another conversation.
So, but let's.
But we do have a reactor, and we do have an industry.
We do.
And not just mining.
Yes.
Lucas Heights does produce
it's in suburban Sydney.
Yes.
And it's in suburban Sydney.
Not close to any important population.
No, not at all.
So we're not starting from nothing.
This is true.
Starting from blank sheet.
True, but we don't talk about that because it's a rather inconvenient truth.
It's medical. It's fine.
You've mentioned so many things that are not part of the layperson's understanding of denying the opponent free access is enough to make us difficult to to subdue, and other things like that are all part of the military doctrine we don't understand. So you have to develop these people. Are we getting enough people in the bottom end of or the top end of the funnel, so that they can end up at the top end of the pyramid later?
And I think it's one of the real national treasures or characteristics of the Defence Force is the nation-building role. In the past, we used to actually train the cooks and the plumbers and the electricians until all of that got outsourced, and we were assured Australian industry would train the next generation. Of course, they didn't. They just got government to import more people with those qualifications. So we have a training gap there. And more calls for more immigration to fix the shortage of people to build houses. But defence, you'll have a broad sense that defence does a lot of training and puts a lot of money into it and does a lot of expensive training. I had a conversation a week ago with someone who was a former New South Wales policeman, reasonably young, so this is a recent example. And I said, in a former job when I was over at Point Cook in charge of the Air Force College that looks after the induction of people into the military and the basic training, I went and visited the Victorian Police Academy at Camberwell, because I thought there might be some commonalities, and surprise, surprise, it was very, very similar to the training that we do. The thing that really stood out and made me sit back was when I found out that before people can apply to join the Victorian Police Force, at that time, there was a large waiting list. They have to have all of these qualifications that they had to get themselves, certain first aid certificates, certain driver's license, various bits and pieces, medical, that they had to do at their own expense, and stuff that the military would do. The person I was having a conversation with said, in New South Wales, I've got a $20,000 HEX bill from my training, basic training as a New South Wales policeman. We have to pay for the training as well. And he said, and it was crap. They used it as an elephant's graveyard. They put the has-beens in there into the school. And it's very, very poor quality training. So now back to what the military do. How many organisations in Australia will send someone to Harvard for a year like they did myself? All expenses paid and even a small entertainment allowance. And that is simply, we didn't send many people there. It's probably only half a dozen or so have gone. But opportunities arise, and we'll put a couple of people in. You have the main system that does the meat and potatoes of the stew, but sometimes you like a little bit of chili or something to spice up. And because it's a big organisation, we've got deep pockets. We can afford to do that. And in a career, we probably give, for the officers, 2 one-year sabbaticals during a career. Junior Staff College, which is around about the 15-year mark for majors, where they come offline and they go into a college in Canberra and do navel gazing and study what the other services do. And then 10 years later or so, they repeat the exercise at a higher level to prepare them for star rank, where they'd look out at the rest of the world and where Australia fits there and how defence fits in with industry, and prepared to be able to give policy advice, I guess. Again, that's another year of full pay. So there's a lot, quite apart from the technical training. I think our radio technicians for the Air Force aeroplanes were a 2-year program, used to be done at Laverton. That's after their basic recruit training. So we spent a lot in good quality training.
I have one final question before we wrap up. Do you think attack is still the best form of defence?
I'd never choose either. I think it depends on, as a general rule, it depends on the situation. If you're playing sport, if you're even there, I don't think they can agree. Sometimes they'll play offence, sometimes they'll play defence. But in terms of Australia's defence, we would probably say deterrence is the best form of defence. And so and if we do have to fight, we want to fight as far away from Australia as possible. Hence the sea air gap as the last resort, yes, or very, very last resort, as someone actually silly enough to put boots on the ground in Australia. Although these days it would probably be more sending missiles from a distance, or cyber, or some sort
Or
of
a virus, maybe.
Well, look, that's been enormously fascinating, and it's fantastic to be able to get the benefit of your many decades of experience in a field that most of us don't think about too much at all. We leave it to you professionals, and we hope that it's all happening. And it's somewhat reassuring that even although we're relatively small as a defence force, I guess, the understanding of what we need to do to create that deterrence is very clear, obviously, from what you've been saying. And there are far greater minds than ours being applied to it. So thank you for your time. I'm a little reassured.
Me too, actually.
I hope that I stay reassured and that we do get some boats in the water. That would be nice to get some boats in the water, if for no other reason than they look cool.
And they go fast.
And they go fast. And
Not-
we're all
not
in
as
favour
fast.
of things that go fast, but apparently not as fast as a titanium noisy Russian
Golden
sub.
boat.
Well, exactly.
Yes.
Or an F-35.
Or an F-35, yes. We'll talk about F-35s maybe on another discussion, because then we get into aircraft, and I know Warwick has got no doubt much to say about aircraft, and there are many others who would be happy to hear about that as well. It's boys' own adventure, that stuff, really. So thank you very much for your time, and we really appreciate your wise words.
Thank you for sitting there and letting me ramble on. Just
Oh,
remember, I'm at the age where I have crystal clear memories of things that never happened. So.